May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
Please be seated. Good morning, this kind of wet and rainy day.
Good morning. Good morning.
Got several questions for you all today, and the first one I'm going to start with is, who am I? This is your first Sunday having me here as your interim rector. Interim rectors do not become rectors of a particular church. Interims are in place to help walk the congregation through this time that it takes to call a new rector. My name is McLemore. I was born in St. Louis, Missouri, grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. After my 4 years in college at Trinity University in San Antonio, I lived in San Antonio for a year, and then 6 years in Dallas. While on vacation with a group of girlfriends from college, we went to Cancun, Mexico in 1978. And I met the man who 3 years later would become my husband. Charles was working in Cancun, and we ended up, our 5-year plan became a 22-year plan. When we moved back to the States, it was to Florida, his home state. I was vicar of St. John's Episcopal Church on Pine Island in Florida. While I was serving there, Charles died in 2008 of cancer. So the next year, I accepted a call to a church in the suburbs of St. Petersburg, Florida, St. Giles in Pinellas Park. At St. Giles, we started a Spanish service, and it's a church very, very similar to St. John's here. In 2013, a colleague priest invited me to come to Jackson, Mississippi, to be an associate rector at a large corporate-sized church that usually has 3 or 4 priests on staff. I spent 5 years at St. James, and about the time you all were learning that Father Matt would be leaving as your rector and going to Mexico City, things were shaking up in the church where I was serving. Out of creation comes this great things that happen to churches when we find out God has a reason for all this chaos. I met with your vestry in early December about the possibility of serving as your interim rector. In March, we started putting signatures to a letter of agreement. Here we all are on this 5th Sunday in Lent, on this rainy day, together, entering into a season of discernment. This is my first call to be an interim rector. I have been through quite a bit of training these last 5 months, and still am working with a small group. In June, I will have been a priest for 19 years, having been ordained to the diaconate in 1999 and the priesthood in 2000 in the Diocese of Southeastern Mexico. My seminary studies were quite unusual, and they involved commuting for 4 years from Cancun to Dallas monthly to the Anglican School of Theology. I think that's enough about me between what I've said, and I believe your senior warden spoke quite a bit last week. We'll call it a day for that. But interim ministry is a time for all of us to be discerning as a congregation. What will be the next steps, the next direction? A change has happened in this church, and now the church is transitioning. One of my questions for St. John's is, who is St. John's? I read a beautifully written, detailed history of the church in a notebook given to me. You all are very fortunate for all that has been saved over the years, the photos, the memoirs, the notes, the letters, and how it's all being collected, because here is captured so much of the DNA of this church. However, this question of who is St. John's takes us even deeper. A church is defined by the people, and St. John's is defined by those who have been here from the beginning and those who have just recently walked through your doors. St. John's is defined by the relationship you each have with one another and with God. Think about the question, why do you attend St. John's? What calls you? What keeps you, endears you, supports you, comforts you, and maybe at times even frustrates you? Just like the love of family and friends, what is that gem that brings you back? What is that gem that might even tease you to invite a friend, a neighbor to experience a particular service or event or offering for? And this is the perfect segue into my next question. St. John's, who is your neighbor? Neighbor being defined by who lives literally across the street and around us, who lives in a 5-mile radius, who lives in a 10-mile radius, who's been touched by the outreach from this church, who are people that are your neighbors that you don't even know their names, who do you love as Christ calls us to love one another? A third and final question for you to ponder. What is God calling St. John's to do? We know St. John's history, the past. We have a sense of where we are today. At least we're living in it. But what about the future? I take you to our gospel that we just heard. This is a story about Jesus's and his dealing with past, present, and future. He and his disciples have come to Bethany, to the home of dear, dear friends of Jesus. Lazarus and his sisters, Mary and Martha, are hosting these dear friends and the disciples for a meal. The mood was surely joyful, because in this gospel, in the part just above of our reading today, it talks about this is when Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead. And they were all very curious, surely, about who is this man that raises people up from the dead? An important piece of history from this reading is that the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where Jesus was, he should notify them so that they might arrest Jesus. This bringing a dead man back to life was just too intimidating, too strange, too unusual. They feared that the Romans would come and take away both their place and their nation. This Jesus had to be stopped immediately, and the plot to kill him was started. But back to today's reading. 6 days before the Passover. And surely this is a home where Jesus feels, at least for the moment, safe, secure, comforted. Mary is elated, and she takes a pound of expensive perfume, this nard, and begins to anoint his feet, wiping his feet with her hair. And Judas just jumps all over her and chastises her, saying, "What are you doing? We could have gotten 300 denarii, equal to 300 days of pay for that. And just think of all the poor that we could have taken care of with this money." Well, Judas really had no concern for the poor. He was in charge of the treasury, and he just wanted to boost the funds a little bit, so he would have more funds to pick and choose how he spent them. And Jesus, in the midst of all that, says, "Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. The poor you always will have with you, but you do not always have me." So who is Jesus? Where was he going? Who believed in him? Who is called to carry on? Well, God calls us to carry on. What does this mean? How are we to carry on? And as we close Lent this coming week, entering into Holy Week and Eastertide, our continual prayer is for God's guidance, his wisdom, ears to hear, and hearts to sense these three questions. Who are we? Who are our neighbors? And what is God calling us to do? Amen.
Amen.